Good evening, friends and colleagues. I am Doré Noyes, the president-elect of the American Folklore Society, and as such it falls to me to introduce the presidential address of Kay Turner. Now, this woman is not going to be an easy act to follow. No more is she an easy act to introduce, because the ceremonial forms available to us, those of American civil religion, are really ill-equipped to provide a frame for Kay Turner. To present our president in anything approaching the style to which she is accustomed, we need to go abroad for models. French presidents of France, are told at the moment of their inauguration, "You incarnate France, you symbolize the République, and you represent the French people." Reversing that order, I would submit that our Madame Prez represents American folklorists, symbolizes the American Folklore Society, and above all, incarnates the transgressive spirit of the vernacular. Kay represents American folklorists. She is one of us, and her trajectory is representative of the fields, which is to say that it's not actually a trajectory in the linear sense, but something more like a dance, involving both choreography and improvisation, both movements of departure and movements of return. As with most of us, her fieldwork has demanded both self-discovery and self-estrangement. Like most of us, she has circulated between the academy and public practice. Like most of us, she is at once scholarly and engaged. But much more than most of us, she has been indifferent to disciplinary boundaries when they get in the way of discovery, and at the same time insistent on the value of folklore's specific lineage. She has good reason to be, for she was formed as a folklorist in Austin in the 1970s, perhaps, well, certainly one of the most creative time-space coordinates in the history of our field, and at any rate where the action was at that moment. Unlike most of her professors, Kay did not work on verbal art, but on Mexican-American religious folk life, foregrounding women actors in that nominally patriarchal society. She brought semiotic and feminist perspectives to bear on an overturning of material culture theory, in which the ephemeral and the assemblage became the norm, and permanence and authorial integrity the exceptional cases. Today, we take this for granted, but when I was at the Penn grad program and the Philadelphia Folklore Project in the late 1980s, this news came to us from Kay's work with her collaborators, Susie Seraph and Pat Jasper. With the latter, she also curated the pioneering exhibition, Art Among Us, Arte Entre Nosotros, which took a holistic approach to vernacular aesthetics in the life world of Mexican Americans. Kay's later book, Beautiful Necessity, The Art and Meaning of Women's Altars, synthesized the insights of her early articles and public programs. And when she had moved from Texas to New York and woke up one morning to 9/11, Kay's early work put her in a position to understand the display forms taken by vernacular outpourings of grief. Kay's insight into ephemeral expression as the glue of relationships led her into pop culture and literary studies with a book collecting women's dreams about Madonna, the other Madonna, and two anthologies of lesbian love letters, a general collection, Dear Sappho, and Gertrude Stein's letters to Alice B. Toklas, Baby Precious Always Shines. When queer theory started to make a place for itself, Kay was already there. The objective correlative of this intellectual readiness was her relocation to Brooklyn and to NYU, once again where the action is and where she has become a significant part of the action. At the same time, she has not neglected her folklore roots, becoming an influential voice as fairy tale scholarship turns to sexuality studies for insight, especially in her co-edited volume with Pauline Greenhill, Transgressive Tales, Queering the Grimms. In representing American folklorists, Kay also symbolizes the American Folklore Society. She has taken that responsibility seriously, not only in her time as president, but through the course of her career. She has made the field matter. As a museum curator, the co-founder of the pioneering public agency, Texas Folklife Resources, the director of folk arts with the Brooklyn Arts Council, adjunct professor of gender and sexuality studies and also performance studies at NYU, and in smaller roles with the Smithsonian, the National Endowments, foundations, and pretty much every ambit into which the field has spread tendrils, as well as on the board of AFS and the New York Folklore Society. Her public record has been honored with our Benjamin Botkin Prize and her intellectual contribution with election to the Folklore Fellows. In her time as president, she has worked to diversify and renew our membership with the foregrounding of the Cultural Diversity Committee and the creation of the Smithsonian Chapel Hill Internship Initiative. She has moved to reconnect us with the Modern Language Association and revitalize our academic programs. Not least, she has worked to shepherd our succession process as we move to a new executive director. Less formally, but most memorably, she has provided the Society with the ludic nocturne to its daylight labors in creating our most beloved ritual, the croning. As that makes clear, Kay incarnates the transgressive vernacular. She has always been a performer in situ, constructing art out of old materials and new predicaments. As founder and lead singer of the long-lived Austin band Girls in the Nose, the later duo Snaggletooth, and her current synthesis, queer scholarship into song with her new band, Kay Turner and the Pages. With that deep voice, she excites vibrations, and with that enthusiasm, she lights bonfires. Kay speaks to us today on a theme that, like all her work, integrates scholarly chops with utopian yearnings, the witch in flight. But before she flies away, we hope not far, we have our ceremonial moment, both ephemeral and deep, in which to enthrone the crone. Madame la Présidente, à toi la parole.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, Dory, you killed me. Oh, that made me tired. All this. Well, I want to give you this talk this evening, but I really want to talk to you because I have such strong feelings for so many people who are in this room tonight and for many people who I don't know as well. The work that we do together, the work that we have done, the work I've done over so many years now, 40 years in folklore, has really been grounded in the American Folklore Society and in the relationships that I have made here with all of you and with a number of people who have passed away, and now with a whole younger audience of crazy folklorists who came to the Prince party last night and we danced our asses off. And the police came, which is a... I don't think we've been shut down since 1986. It was great to see him, too, with his holstered gun and everything. So, yes, I do want to have this moment with you. Being president of AFS yields gifts galore, especially the opportunity to collaborate with the board, staff, and membership to bring our society forward into the future. I thank all of you for electing me to the honor and privilege of serving the American Folklore Society. Additionally, I thank you for two special perks: the presidential suite, 2 years' worth of hotel swank, and the presidential address, a chance this evening to share concerns and to test fly some material that will add pages to my current book and performance project called What a Witch. Said not like a 10-year-old dissing her girlfriend, what a witch, but like a woman feeling her power, what a witch. I dedicate this presentation this evening to folklore feminists everywhere. Continuing where we left off at Miami's 2016 Women's Section Croning, I invite the coven of the feminist killjoys and friends, all of you, to convene once again. Tonight, I'll hook a ride with the witch in flight to prove the depth of folklore's delights for me as a feminist, lesbian, queer woman who entered graduate school at UT Austin 40 years ago last month. It's been a great journey, and now there's one more to take. I'm going to board my broom, and as Bette Midler, playing the witch in Hocus Pocus, commands her sisters with such pride and satisfaction, I too will command all of you. Let's ride. Let's ride. I began my presidency 3 years ago now with an urgent desire to reinvest our discipline's core understanding of folk narrative. Perhaps more than any other aspect of our nearly 200-year-old discipline, the collection, study, and analysis of narrative arts, storytelling, and storytellers has been the central gift of folklore to the humanities and to the world. Our deep commitment to and expertise in stories, unfolding and unfinished in their variations through time, inspires me to continue in the vein of so many colleagues who have preceded and the many who will go ahead in doing one of the things folklore does best, telling the story of traditional stories. I'd be surprised if folklorists around the hemisphere and those sitting in this room had not taken note, whether dismayed or delighted, that today everybody's a storyteller, caught up in the frenzy driven by the current hegemony of the me story, promoted across a dizzying array of web platforms, including Facebook and YouTube, as well as in popular live performance projects such as StoryCorps and Storyscapes and The Moth. These afford limitless access for the performance of what I think are reductive personal stories. Folklore's corrective to the current glut of disposable first-person narration engages us in recommitting to the explanatory and interpretive power of the third-person folk narrative, performed in its many distinct genres and cultural variations, repeated and revised over generations. Ours is the very important disciplinary charge specific to folkloristics of revealing the significance of collectively owned narratives, the ones that give us the shareable world envisioned in Aristotle's Poetics, the ones that allow the willing suspension of disbelief to stimulate imaginative identifications and attachments. Arjun Appadurai has argued that works of the imagination create a collective platform from which to project notions of, quote, resistance, irony, selectivity, and in general, agency, end quote. Old stories and their variants constitute one such platform, allowing tellers to take that same old plot or tale type and make it useful over and over again by working it, making it say something new to us, not only by giving answers, but by raising questions. Stories as equipment for living, or good to think with, even better to feel with. I chase old stories that raise questions about the status of women, questions about sex and gender, about feeling queer and being queer. It's no wonder my career trajectory led me to the witch figure, whose stories make a mess of sex and gender, exposing their socially constructed, binary-driven hegemonies, yet serving also as a source for recognizing potential alternatives. If my previous forays into the witchy worlds of Grimm's Frau Trude and Frau Holle prove anything, it is that the witch knew queer before queer was gay or gay was queer. seething with unsettled depths of transgressive or unrecognized feelings and desires, which stories disturb and often dismantle comfortably institutionalized ideas about convention, order, and control, the control of women. Because witches are characterized by their defiant failure to fit. They are woman always, but they are also unwoman, undisciplined, unnerving, unnatural. Thankfully, they are not normal. Rather, they enjoy a transgressive jouissance, an ontological joy of difference from the standard, the married, childbearing, second-class woman, second-sex, female, owned by God's decree and husband's law. Witches revel in their contrary aspirations. They live apart. They eat children. They help young girls achieve a sense of their own agency. They are lesbian in their refusal to accept Oedipus as the father of all desires. I could go on. Unnatural and abnormal, she dwells on the other side of the binary slash, also anomalous, ambivalent, liminal, magical, and shape-shifting. Sitting at the crossroads on a throne of decaying garbage, she makes a claim for life beyond dualistic restrictions. Witches bitch the binary. Do they break it? Sometimes I think they do. Here, as likely you've already discerned and perhaps tweeted out, and Dom, where are you? Are you, okay, come on, let's get it going. Here, as likely you've already discerned and tweeted, I am interested once again in affirming the potential for bringing folk narrative interpretation closer to feminist and queer strategies for telling, reading, listening, and knowing. That a genuine connection exists, I uphold by underscoring the effectiveness of feminist and queer methods and theories to enhance our ability to read traditional stories in the 21st century. Importantly, the reverse also proves true. Foundational folk narrative resources, from story collections to historic geographic methods and motif indexes to structural analysis, should be found on gender and literature syllabi worldwide. I know I'm preaching to the coven here, but it bears remembering. It bears remembering that folkloristics, and I feel very strongly about this, folkloristics alone in the humanities provides evidence and tools too often underutilized, even unrecognized in related fields for demonstrating the social and artistic effectiveness of telling the same story twice or 1,000 times and interpreting it differently. In my work, those tools are effectively implemented in spaces for story interpretation opened by the feminist and lesbian reading revolution of the 1980s and 90s. Under the umbrella of reader response theory, perverse reading, a concept that was first brought to us by Bonnie Zimmerman, engendered the willful lesbian interpretation of literature against the grain of heteronormative convention. Once the doors of LGBTQ perception opened, there was no going back. Queer theory then added Eve Sedgwick's methods of reparative reading that consider, quote, the many ways selves and communities succeed in extracting sustenance from the objects of a culture, even of a culture whose avowed desire has often been not to sustain them. Let's extract some sustenance, shall we? Let's feed off some big questions about socially spurned, politically burned witches. The kinds of questions a queer feminist folklorist likes to ask. Why do witches fly? Where do they go? Why should we care? For me, these questions combine like glyphs on an endgame Rosetta Stone, and to approach answering them gestures toward deciphering another, even greater question, one we all must ask: why folklore? We'll leave that anxiety-producing question aside for now to concentrate on the witch quandary. In the Western imagination, helped initially by the pornographic visual culture of witches promoted by 15th and 16th century artists such as Albrecht Dürer and Hans Baldung, and continuing to the present day, our popular stereotype of the broom-straddling witch overrides, pun intended, her older Avian associations. Broom-flying witches, the subject of another talk on another day, hardly exist before they come into print, beginning in 1440 with a tiny image in marginalia. Long before brooms, cooking sticks, and giant spindles were mounted lasciviously in nocturnal flights to meet the devil, witches worldwide flew with wings. In the beginning was the witch, and the witch was a woman, but not only a woman. She was part bird. Take Lilith, for example. Biblically referred to only once in Isaiah 34:14 in a list of creatures exiled to the desert, the King James Bible translates her name as screech owl, alluding to night flights in search of prey. This scant mention, however, gave rise to numerous apocryphal stories assigning Lilith as the first wife of Adam, a mistake made by God. Though he created both from the same earth, she was not given equal rights or dominion. Angered, she refused to submit to Adam and flew away, or was exiled by God and flew away to the Red Sea, or flew away and returned in vengeful attacks on Adam, Eve, and their progeny. I only want you to underscore or hashtag, she flew away. She had wings. And when the patriarchal situation got going rough, she simply fluttered away. Sisters to Lilith include the Greek sirens and harpies, all figures of desirous, headstrong hybrids. Not as old, but old enough, the Russian Baba Yaga retains bird-like qualities too, of course. She lives in her house on chicken leg stilts and famously loves flying about in a mortar using the pestle for a rudder and a broom to sweep her tracks. Dubravka Ugrasek links her origins to early Slavic and Russian, Eastern European, and other Russian images of bird women. Remaining for the most part earthbound, the Grimm's witches do fly occasionally in brief avian transformations, such as in Hansel and Gretel and Jorinda and Joringel. Now, the witch in Jorinda and Joringel actually deserves some special mention. She's a bit of an avianaholic who has captured hundreds of young ladies and turned them into birds she keeps in cages all over her house. In local legend, witches about to be burned in Moscow by Ivan the Terrible turn into magpies and fly away. And folklorist Barbara Reedy's study of Newfoundland witch lore recounts a fisherman's pursuit out into the water by a crow. Having no luck getting a fish, he shoots and wounds the crow he believes is a witch out to curse him. He later sees an old woman walking near the shore with her arm in a sling. These are but a few examples suggesting that in stories widespread over time, avian female hybridity affords witches their primary means of flight. Part of the answer to why witches fly is because they have the physical instrument to do so. But of course there's more. The early association of women and birds poses ontological as well as utilitarian questions concerning the need for or the desirability of flight. The figure of the flying witch captivates. Her many stories reveal a complex, contradictory, and for me, a strangely consoling nature. I turn now to one such story that I first read decades ago. From house to house, I've carted the beaten-up, spine-broken book in which this story appeared, because that same book is also my folklore touchstone. Americo Paredes published his edited collection, Folktales of Mexico, in 1970. One in the popular University of Chicago Press series, Folktales of the World, edited by Richard Dorson. This was back in the day of incentivized folktale collections, when widespread popular interest in folktales followed on the heels of the folk song revival. I ordered that book as background reading for a year-long excursion to Mexico in 1974, the life-changing journey that later brought me to folklore studies. I didn't know who Dr. Paredes was, but the book's verso described him as a University of Texas professor who directed the Center for Intercultural Studies in Folklore and Oral History. To this day, I can see myself reading that little bio and coming to a halt on the word folklore. That light that has gone bright for so many of us turned bright for me. Folklore, I said aloud to myself. Maybe that's what I'm interested in. It seems fitting to return to Dr. Paredes' influence on me, Mexico's influence, Mexican-American women's influence. That's where I started, and it's a great pleasure to round the bend of a full circle with you this evening by paying some dedicated attention to a story in that book called The Witch Wife. Sourced by Paredes as a local legend or caso, a belief tale, he also says the story is widespread in Greater Mexico, and my additional research finds versions in New Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Colombia. Collected by Jacob Pimentel in San Cristobal de las Casas, Chiapas, on September 24, 1954, this tale was told to him by Efrain Paniagua, a 35-year-old school teacher, and the story was subsequently published in an article called Creencias in the annual of the Society for Mexican Folklore. The tale is brief. I'll give it to you whole. The Witch Wife. They say that in the Nahuatl-speaking district of San Cristobal de las Casas, there lived a man and his wife. The woman was a witch, and she was deceiving her husband. It was her custom to say some magic words that made the flesh drop from her bones, leaving nothing but the skeleton. Then she would sprout wings, and the skeleton would go out flying through the air. In this shape, she would go out every night and frighten people out at late hours. When her husband found out she was deceiving him and that her skeleton went out every night, he decided to punish her. One night, he lay awake in bed pretending he was asleep. He heard noises as his wife got out of bed and went out into the street. He got up too and followed her. Hiding in the shadows, he saw how the flesh dropped from his wife's bones and how wings sprouted from her skeleton. Then he saw her fly away, making a noise like bones falling apart. When he got over his fright, he went where the flesh was, and he chopped it up into bits with his machete. Then he sprinkled salt over it so it would die. Then he went back and hid in a corner and waited for the skeleton to return. When this took place, the skeleton stood before the flesh and said the words to make it come back into place. But the flesh did not obey because it was dead. The despairing skeleton flew away. Many are the people who see this being flying through the air at night, and they say it announces somebody's death. In 18 rigorously condensed and dramatic sentences, the tale strings together a number of witch motifs found in Thompson, including witch flies through the air, witch followed by husband, man discovers his wife is a witch who is out of skin is prevented from re-entering it when person salts or peppers skin, and also appearance of ghost as death omen. In the same collection, Paredes also gives us tales of dancing witches with chicken feet and of a witch mother-in-law who takes the form of a black hen. This witch wife tale that I've told you links with others such as the brothers who married witches and the greater corpus of night hag tales, some of which feature women who get out of their skin. My own limited field-based collecting of witch tales, I hope to do more in the post-presidential years, centers on Brooklyn Guyanese stories of Old Hag, a baby snatcher who flies into your house as a ball of fire, and the Dominican La Sihuapa, whose long black hair is not long enough to cover her backward-facing feet. Drawing from the lineage, I turned to Don Americo's Witch Wife with the purpose of using a single tale to explore multiple answers to my question, Why do witches fly? Drawing from the lineage of Propp, Levi-Strauss, and Dundas, whose structural approach to story analysis I continue to rely on, I subscribe to the Alan Dundas method of using structure as a key to interpretation, taking a small tale, as he did, for example, in The Making and Breaking of Friendship, and seeing how morally large it actually is. Our tale strings together motifs that in turn are hung on oppositions and equivalences strongly associated with symbolic sex, gender, and life-death issues. Most obvious are opposite pairs: male-female, man-woman, husband-wife, day-night, home-street, skin-bones, dropping flesh, sprouting wings, joy and despair, salt, magic words, deception-truth, interior-exterior, earth-sky, and of course, life-death, complicated by another pair, woman-being, not binary, but philosophical opposites. The strong contrasts create a palpable tension. The tale invests heavily in dyadic constraints. But as critic Dan Chiasson says of poetry, so I think we can say of tales such as this one. With any art of imposed constraint, we look for the moments when the constraints are defied. Elegant binary aesthetics position this story's potential for diverse interpretations. Though Paredes notes it as a tale told by a man to a man, I of course read it and hear it as a story of great interest for women. One line of feminist analysis might simply throw this story into the patriarchal dustbin of cautionary stories aimed at curbing women's appetite for deceit. For me, though, the central advantage of this story is its detailed portrayal of a witch who flies. Our folkloristic interest in vernacular performatives combines with my feminist and queer theory leanings to demonstrate that flight proves a powerful antidote to the female body weighed down and weighted by the determinations of men. My active interpretation deploys all of these in an effort to discover how certain traditional stories might be understood to offer moments when constraints are defied. Our Mrs. nightly gets out of the skin that defines her as a woman owned by a man in marriage. By day, let's assume she performs her wifely duties, cooks, cleans, submits, rarely leaves the house. Certainly she's not seen walking alone on the streets that in small Mexican towns are the domain of men. Only a whore, a woman out of bounds, does that. However, she's in the street at night, removes her skin there, and once airborne, leaves wife behind to become its opposite, witch. Yet I would argue that in both manifestations she remains, importantly, a woman. The temporal indeterminacy of folk and fairy tales give us plenty of tether to speculate that the wife may have been sneaking out for years. That she flew on a regular basis is also signaled in the phrase, quote, "it was her custom," unquote, to transform herself using magic words. This special formula also indicates her place within a lineage of witches. After all, where did she learn those magic words? Momentarily, in that performative speech act, we gain entree to the world of hidden knowledge shared by witches across generations of traditional practices. In a world that silences women to valorize men's decrees, the power of linguistic countersystem, given evidence here, allows a woman to slip off the skin known by patriarchy and rise in the bones that belong to her alone. Now, don't get me wrong. Oh, yes, you can. Our wife may have liked having it both ways. Earth by day, sky by night, wouldn't you? And maybe that's the point. She just needs some time in darkness when her husband can't find her and the binary can't bind her. Who knows? Maybe she even liked her husband, somewhat. Evidently, her deceit was never intended to harm, if only he had remained asleep. But his deceit in stalking her, spying on her, results in his murder of the skin that touched to his made their marriage. This husband, who thought he owned his wife by owning her flesh, reacts with extreme viciousness. Patriarchal overkill, chopping the skin into bits, burning it, salting it. The hold of the owner-owned husband-wife opposition breaks violently, by his hand and the machete gripped in it. Emotionally overcome by his possessiveness, he punishes her, or thinks he does, by exiling her, killing the skin that defined her to him as universal wife, subject to all the labors and abuses women suffer on earth. The very skin she nightly chose to be rid of anyway. Skin wraps the carnal mortal body, the sex-identifying body, but loosed from it, our witch skeletally flies into freedom's sky. Who's zooming who? I think she's zooming him. Though this version of the story says she despairs not being able to return to her skin, does she also anguish over not being able to go back to him? I think not. Despair is not an emotion widely associated with witches. Am I correct? The adjective protrudes, playing to the husband's sense of victory over his errant wife as he stands hidden in the shadows, observing her return to the desecrated skin. A different version might as easily describe her this way: the angry skeleton flew away. The story does leave her inactivated as a human woman, but does she care, really? Remove that one word, she flies free and he's the loser. Leave it in, and she still flies away, which in either case amounts to bye-bye hubby, or as in the Lilith story, bye-bye Yahweh. Why do witches fly? Both Lilith and the witch wife, many millennia apart, suggest that witches fly to fly in the face of men and gods who cannot conceive of women as their equal. The witch wife told in the era of the pussy-grabbing POTUS seems more relevant than ever. Perhaps further unpacking the discursive relationship between skin and skeleton will help complicate what seems such an easy answer to my question. Classic life and death symbols, they appear to be in competition here. Folk and fairy tales trouble the meaning of a woman's skin by at once making it a sign of her carnality and also her transforming capability. Skin circumscribes the real, the mortal body. It is the site of both erotic and traumatic touch, also the surface for disguise and deception. In her nightly abjection of her skin, the wife flees that which envelops and represents female sexual and maternal function, the very sign of the physical vulnerability, excess, and disorder that men abject in women. When those magic words release her, imagine the pleasure she experiences leaving behind her daily skin and all its associations, what it covers and helps reveal, breasts, hips, ass, that make her an object of control by men's combined authority and lust. A wife's skin may be all of this, but a witch's skin additionally vibrates with liminal magical energies. It can be worked for transformation, as the witch in Grimm's Goose Girl at the Spring instructs her young charge to do, meaning, go to the spring, take off your ugly disguise skin, and renew your own beautiful skin. And the witch says to her, go do your work. In our story, the carnal skin by day symbolically conveys her proscribed female aspect, but at night becomes an agent for the witch wife's experience of creative soaring. Her magic words drop her skin to the ground, trading it for wings to power up her skeletal frame. This change happens with a kind of simultaneity that associates the skin and wings. One transposes into the other. Skin and skeleton are not at odds to empower a very different version of her, combining celestial and Thonian powers of transformation. Those conventional life-death skin and skeleton dualities are magically mediated by that third term. She's got wings. A witch on the wing soars above the worldly definitions and confinements of woman. Transgressing and transiting restrictive norms, she self-propels into the rare air of her own pleasure. She animates her own freedom and desire. Deborah Caption usefully summarizes performance genres delineated according to, quote, subjective stances, unquote, by the theater director Richard Schechner. Of interest to me here is one of Richard's delineations, the self-assertive I, what might be referred to as the ego, inhering in the performance of play. If that self-assertive I has been the exclusive province of the male ego at play, then flying witches especially gauge the potential for women's self-performance of the self-assertive I in symbolic acts that signal her authority, self-control, and self-creation. When I am at self-performing play, I am self-governed. In the moment, my intuition heightened and available for inspiration. Could there be a better kind of play? A full self-governed release from all restriction than flying around during the unmonitored nighttime? Nighttime is the right time. Okay, I know some of you prefer to be in bed, but just know that the witch wife is out there doing it for you, doing it for any reader, listener who wants to fly with her. You can stay in bed, get your 8 hours, and still get the benefit of understanding that a witch in flight enacts a command performance and a commanding performative, flying as unmediated liberation of the self-assertive I, a kind of self-propulsion energized by equal parts playfulness, alienation, defiance, and desire. The self-performing witch in flight defies the gravity, the gravitas, the grave of patriarchy. She emblematizes Judith Butler's claim that, quote, there can be no radical politics of change without performative contradiction, unquote. The witch commands an impossible performance of flight with absolutely no basis in reality, yet still she inspires a potentializing fantasy of agency. We're up in the air now. Let's fly higher, farther with her. In the physical sense that strikes most immediately, we feel her experience of expressive self-pleasure, recognizing it as akin to sexual self-pleasure. After all, she left her husband's bed, ultimately provoking his jealous rage. A convention of psychoanalysis, flight in fantasy and dreams, indicates sexual anxiety, need, or fulfillment. Certainly, 16th century German artists whose caricatures of witches stimulated blatant sexual fantasy imputed wanton lust as the fuel that moved their brooms. Their depictions served to accuse, even as they accurately reflected a sense, a very threatening one to men, that flying sisters could do it for themselves. Whether by brooms or wings, flight symbolically unburdens witch women from male-dominant reproductive sex. They flee those patriarchal givens to enjoy transgressive pleasures on the fly. If loosed from her skin, our witch wife performs what seems a notably disembodied gratification. She is no less a desiring, sensual skeleton. Her wings sprout as her bones rattle. She comes as she goes. I'm happy to leave these answers: escape, play, self-performance, and self-pleasure, lingering together in the air through which she flies. Still, I want us to go higher into the atmosphere where her active flight becomes a phenomenologically queer act, a self-performing dislocation from the site of patriarchal order, and an experience of disorientation from the restraints of binary patterns. No longer oriented to or located by those patterns, a witch in flight is everywhere and nowhere, completely out of bounds, not inhabiting or inhabited. In her work, Queer Phenomenology, Sarah Ahmed accounts for a kind of queer disorientation, saying it occurs, quote, when the ground fails to support an action. She describes disorientation as becoming oblique, what I would call becoming slanted. Not the commonplace disorientation of dizziness or being lost, but rather picture the witch angling skyward. She disorients herself. Flying aslant and away marks her nightly repudiation of the social ground that fails to support her self-actualization. You can feel her rising in the story, hear the skeletal shaking, and see the slanting liftoff from whatever the day brought as assignment to role or place or gender, as requirement of a straight life lived in straight time. Flying askance, the witch wife performs disorientation as disavowal, dislocation as defiance, and disengagement as desire. Or in the words of Jose Munoz, she, quote, vacates the here and now for the then and there, pushing off into the horizonless nowhere of a night sky filled with potentiating darkness and beckoning stars. You can't track her with your GPS. Her self-empowered disorientation breaks through the binary that constructs sex-gender normalcy built on geolocation coordinates of center, margin, domestic public, home and street, and so on. Queerness endorses escape as a mode of discovery and as a defense against the alienations of the binary. This queer figure of self-possession, a magically engineered trope of fleeing through flight, finally escapes all human identification with her status change at the end of the story. Prevented from coming back into her female skin, she departs, and, quote, many are the people who see this being flying through the air at night, unquote. From wife woman to witch woman to post-human non-gendered being, all in one brief tale? Not bad for folklore, right? She escapes her binary life once and for all, makes a move from biology to ontology. If she were with us tonight, the transformed, unclassifiable witch wife might wish to correct our pronoun usage. Certainly in the 21st century, this Mexican she has become, in the end, a Latinx they. I'll make the shift right now. If previously their nightly sky jaunts necessitated secrecy, now they appear to many of us. They start showing off, swirling, spiraling, moving closer then retreating, flapping like a crow, diving like an owl. They invite us, the still grounded, to witness marvelous, if fleeting, performances of freedom. But we can't handle that. Too impossible, too good to be true. So we assign they a new relationship to us as a too scary harbinger, a portent of someone's death. But I'm not sure that's the message they intend us to read from a winged skeleton flying above. The folklore of birds as messengers finds that they predict death and disaster, but also herald births and imminent marriages. Like they's kindred dancing skeletons and laughing calaveras who appear for Los Dias de los Muertos, our witch might actually be saying, enjoy life while you live it, have it to live. Or perhaps we are simply meant to be provoked into asking one more time, why do witches fly? Did I fail to warn you that my question was impossible to answer entirely this evening, or ever? Happily, in folklore studies, especially pertaining to stories, decipherment is rarely finalized. For me, interpretation is an ongoing project of folkloristics as maiutics, from the Greek to birth ideas, midwifing the many meanings of Eve and Lilith, Hecate and Medusa, La Befana and Grilla, the night hag, the witch wife, La Siwapa and oldie hag, Frau Truda and Mother Hola. And there's always another witch to yank from between the legs of Mother Folklore. Still, I hope we've kicked my Rosetta Stone down the road a bit tonight. Enough to say that the illuminating performance given by the witch in flight helps light up our understanding, not only of women's agency, but of the particular value, importance, and agency of folklore and folkloristics. Let's go meta in our final moments. Meta-narrational, metaphorical, and then I'll take some metamucil. There's a story within her story. It's the story of folklore, the witch of the humanities. I leave it to you to keep her aloft. I give it to you to fly with her. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you. My privilege. My privilege. Thank you so much. Now I have one last offering here. I told you at the beginning of the evening that my What a Witch project is a book project, but also a performance project. So I've been doing these witch performances since around 2012, past 5 years or so. And one of the reasons that I kind of decided that I would just take the witch wife out of Dr. Paredes's Mexican folktale book and just try to work it was because I'm actually going to do a performance based on this in the spring. So, you know, you kind of, in some ways, you heard the notes for the performance. But I just recently, I wrote, this will be part of the performance. Edna St. Vincent Millay has a wonderful poem called The Witch Wife. And so I set it, it's one of the little things that'll be in the show, and I set it to music just, I don't know, just a couple of weeks ago when I was working on this thing every day and night. So let me just see if I can do this for you, because I thought it would be a nice way to end. She is neither pink nor pale, and she never will be all mine. She learned her hands in a fairy tale, and her mouth on a valentine. She has more hair than she needs. In the sun, 'tis a woe to me. And her voice is a string of colored beads, or steps leading into the sea. She loves me all that she can, and her ways to my ways resign. But she was not made for any man, and she never will be all mine. 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 But I'm all yours. Thank you. Thank you so much.